As I mentioned in our last study together, we are going to study today about the everlasting gospel. And I'd like to read the first angel's message where we find the reference to the everlasting gospel. I'm reading from Revelation chapter 14 and verses 6 and 7. It says the following: Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel, to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come, and worship Him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water. Interestingly enough, the Apostle John wrote several books of the New Testament. He wrote the Gospel of John, Revelation, as well as 3 epistles. But this is the only time in the writings of John where you find the word gospel, and much less the everlasting gospel. Now, because this is the only time in the writings of John where we find the reference to the gospel, it's necessary for us to go to other places in Scripture to study this topic of the everlasting gospel. And so we're going to go to other places in Scripture that describe the meaning of the everlasting gospel. Now, the first question that we want to ask is this: why is the gospel called everlasting? After all, the Bible tells us that the gospel was the salvation event in Jesus Christ. So what makes the gospel everlasting? Well, in order to understand why the gospel is everlasting, we need to go back to the story that we find of the fall in the book of Genesis. So go back with me to Genesis chapter 2, and we're going to look at several important details that will set the framework for understanding the meaning of the everlasting gospel. The first thing that I want to review from Genesis 1 and 2 is that God, that is Jesus, created Adam and Eve holy, innocent, and righteous. And the Bible tells us that in order to show this righteousness in a visible way, God clothed Adam and Eve with a literal robe of light. But that literal robe of light symbolized something. It represented something. The literal robe of light represented their righteousness, their obedience to the law of God. In other words, the literal robe of light represented obedience to God's law. It showed that Adam and Eve were righteous because they had not broken God's holy law. But we're told in the book of Genesis that when Adam and Eve sinned, the first result of their sin was that this literal robe of light disappeared. And we find in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25 the description of what happened when the robe of light disappeared. It says there in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25, first of all, about their original condition, and then we'll read verse 7 of chapter 3. It says, And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. But now notice verse 7. Immediately after their sin, it says, Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked.